Joe Burrow just said something that instantly got the entire Bengals fan base talking. And honestly, it's one of those comments that can completely change how people look at this team heading into the season. Because according to Burrow himself, this might actually be the most talented roster the Cincinnati Bengals have had during his entire time in Cincinnati. And the crazy part is, when you really start breaking it all down piece by piece, there's a legitimate argument for it. Now, at first glance, a lot of fans probably hear that and immediately think back to the Super Bowl run or the back-to-back AFC championship teams. Those rosters had proven veterans, playoff experience, huge moments, clutch defensive performances, and some of the best chemistry we've seen from this organization in years. So hearing Burrow say this current team could actually be more talented than those groups feels bold, really bold. But once you start comparing the roster position by position, once you really look at where this team is stronger today versus where those previous Bengals teams had weaknesses, the conversation becomes a lot more interesting than people expected. Before we go any further, though, if you love deep Bengals conversations like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel because we're going to be covering every major storyline surrounding this team all season long. And trust me, if this roster lives up to the expectations we're talking about today, this could end up being one of the most fascinating Bengals seasons of the Joe Burrow era. Now, let's get to what matters. The biggest thing here is understanding exactly what Burrow means when he says most talented. Because there's a difference between the best overall team and the most talented roster on paper. Those aren't always the same thing. Sometimes a team has better chemistry. Sometimes a team executes better in huge moments. Sometimes injuries completely derail a season before we even get to see the full potential. And that's really what makes this conversation complicated. When people think back to the 2021 Bengals, they remember the magic. They remember the playoff run. They remember going into Tennessee and winning despite Burrow getting sacked 7 times. They remember the comeback against Kansas City. They remember the defense stepping up in huge moments. But even the people discussing this admitted something important. That team had flaws everywhere. There were stretches during that season where nobody really knew what the Bengals were. They started hot, cooled off, lost games they shouldn't have lost, then suddenly caught fire again at the perfect time. The offensive line was a mess. Burrow took an unbelievable amount of punishment. The roster had clear weak points, yet somehow they kept finding ways to survive. And that's why this current roster becomes so interesting in comparison. Because offensively, there's a real argument that the core stars are simply better now than they were back then. Burrow himself was mentioned as being a better quarterback today than he was in 2021. Ja'Marr Chase has evolved since his rookie year. Higgins is more polished. The offensive system has expanded. The offense itself has become more flexible. That matters. People forget sometimes how young those stars still were during the Super Bowl run. Burrow was still ascending. Chase was exploding onto the scene, but he hadn't fully mastered every aspect of his game yet. Higgins was still developing into the complete receiver he is today. So while that 2021 team may have accomplished more, the raw talent level at those key positions may genuinely be higher now. And then you get to the offensive line. This is where the conversation really starts tilting toward the current Bengals roster. Back in those playoff runs, the offensive line constantly felt one injury away from disaster. Eventually, it became exactly that. The 2022 team especially suffered devastating injuries up front. La'el Collins went down, Alex Kappa got hurt, Jonah Williams got hurt. By the playoffs, they were forced into situations nobody wanted to see. Jackson Carman ended up playing left tackle during the postseason. Max Sharping was starting. Cordell Volson was thrown into the lineup immediately as a rookie. And despite all that, the Bengals were still one play away from another Super Bowl appearance. That's part of why Burrow might truly believe this roster has more upside. Because now, the Bengals are entering the season with far more confidence in the offensive line room than they had during most previous years of the Burrow era. There's belief in the young talent. There's belief in the continuity. There's belief that this unit can actually become a strength instead of just something the offense survives. One of the biggest names constantly brought up in this discussion was Amarius Mims. The expectations around him are massive. There's also confidence surrounding players like Dylan Fairchild. The discussion basically came down to this. Some of the young linemen currently on this roster wouldn't just compete for jobs against previous Bengals offensive linemen, they would probably beat them out. That says a lot about how much the perception of the trenches has changed. And honestly, that may be the single biggest reason Burrow sees this roster differently. Because think about what the Bengals' offense has looked like over the years when Burrow actually had protection. When he's healthy and comfortable, the offense becomes one of the most dangerous units in football. The problem has always been consistency in front of him. Now imagine combining a more mature Burrow with a stronger offensive line and a receiving group that's still elite. That's where things get scary. But this conversation becomes even more fascinating once you shift over to the defensive side of the ball. Because this is where opinions start splitting. Some people still lean toward the 2022 defense as the better overall group. And honestly, there's a good argument for that. That defense still had Jesse Bates. It still had Von Bell. It still had DJ Reader playing at an elite level. Sam Hubbard was playing some of the best football of his career. The linebacker group with Logan Wilson and Jermaine Pratt was stable and productive. Chidobe Awuzie was playing high-level football before his injury. Mike Hilton was huge for that defense. That defense had chemistry, communication, and experience. And maybe most importantly, it consistently showed up in massive playoff moments. That's difficult to overlook. But where the current roster starts gaining momentum in the discussion is the defensive front depth. And honestly, one name changed the entire perception of this Bengals defense: Dexter Lawrence. The entire tone of the conversation shifted once they started talking about him. Multiple times, they basically admitted that adding a player like Dexter Lawrence completely changes how people evaluate this team. Because if Lawrence truly plays at the level everyone expects, then the Bengals suddenly have something they haven't had in years: a defensive tackle capable of completely wrecking offenses by himself. And not just stopping the run, impacting the pocket, changing protections, forcing offenses to game plan around him every single week. That kind of presence alters an entire defense. There was even discussion about how if this Bengals defense ends up better than the 2021 unit, then the team is probably going to the Super Bowl. That's how highly they viewed what those previous defenses accomplished in the postseason. But there's still hesitation. Because while the defensive line depth now looks better than previous years, there are still unanswered questions in the secondary. And that leads directly into one of the biggest regrets of the Burrow era: losing Jesse Bates. The conversation around the safety position got brutally honest. They openly admitted the Bengals never fully recovered after losing Bates. They talked about how much the defense depended on his communication, his instincts, and his ability to erase mistakes. They described him as someone who constantly put out fires for the defense. And when the Bengals tried replacing that production with different combinations at safety, things spiraled. Nick Scott struggled in the scheme. Dax Hill struggled with communication responsibilities. The entire back end became unstable. And according to the discussion, that instability created ripple effects throughout the entire defense. That's why Brian Cook became such an important part of this conversation. The Bengals are clearly hoping Cook can finally stabilize the position again. If he becomes the player they believe he can be, then suddenly this defense starts looking much more complete. And honestly, that's the theme throughout this entire debate: potential. projection, upside. This conversation wasn't really about what this Bengals team has already proven. It was about what they could become if all the pieces hit. If Dexter Lawrence dominates. If Brian Cook stabilizes the secondary. If Dax Hill takes a leap. If DJ Turner develops into a true cornerback one. If the offensive line finally becomes reliable. If Burrow stays healthy. If Jamar Chase and T. Higgins continue ascending. Then yes, this absolutely could become the most talented roster of the Joe Burrow era. And that's what makes this entire discussion so exciting for Bengals fans. Because even the people debating this admitted they probably would have laughed at the idea a couple months earlier. The perception of this roster changed dramatically after the additions made to the defensive front and the overall improvements in depth. Suddenly, there's resilience on the roster. Depth at positions that previously collapsed after injuries. More versatility offensively, more flexibility defensively, and maybe for the first time in a while, the Bengals look like a team that won't completely fall apart if one or two injuries happen. That's huge. One of the most interesting points from the discussion was when they talked about Pro Bowl-level talent. The Bengals have consistently had elite top-end players during the Burrow era, but now there's a path toward having even more impact players across the roster if things break correctly. And if that happens, this conversation won't even be controversial anymore. People will simply look back and say, Burrow saw it before everybody else did. Still, there's caution. Even the people leaning toward the current roster admitted the 2022 team remains the toughest comparison. That team had confidence, swagger, continuity. They truly believed they could beat anybody anywhere. And until this current Bengals team proves it on the field, there will always be fans who trust the proven playoff group more than a roster built largely on projection. That's fair. But the fact this debate even exists says a lot about where the Bengals are right now heading into the season. Joe Burrow clearly believes this team is capable of something special. And honestly, when you look at the roster closely, you can understand why. Now I want to hear from you. Do you actually agree with Joe Burrow that this is the most talented Bengals roster of his entire career in Cincinnati? Or do you still believe the 2021 or 2022 teams were better overall? And if this current team really is more talented, does that automatically mean they have to reach the Super Bowl? Drop your thoughts in the comments. But don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel to stay well informed. Go Bengals!